But then we sort of move into Eisenhower coming up with this continuity of government plan. So when you talk about the bunker at the Greenbrier, it wasn't a standalone thing. It was part of a much larger project.
There was something called the Office of Emergency Preparedness. The Office of Emergency Preparedness was the White House office. And so they, and incidentally, somebody mentioned Pearl Harbor. One of the things kind of looming over this whole project was we didn't want another Pearl Harbor. So we wanted to be prepared if there was an attack. And so the Office of Emergency Preparedness kind of worked on this idea of, and then the political issue was the continuity of government. You know, how's the country going to be governed? Again, one of these primary assumptions was Washington was a primary target. So again, this wasn't just, oh, let's build a bunker in the Greenbrier for Congress just for the fun of it, you know. There were all sorts of other plans, and very complex plans. So the idea was if there was danger of imminent attack on Washington, D.C., they could activate the continuity program. You know, Congress would come here, the executive branch would go to Mount Weather, which is just maybe 75 miles west of Washington. And the first project actually was Raven Rock, which was sort of the alternate Pentagon, and that's up near Hagerstown, Maryland. That was the first one they built. So they built that one first. They built Mount Weather second, where the executive branch would go, and then. One of the people I remember, a guy wrote an article in American Heritage magazine, and he tracked down some memos where they were discussing this, and what Eisenhower, his contribution was, if the government's going to survive in its constitutional framework, we need to have a facility for Congress. Because he was keenly aware that in times of stress, power tends to flow to the executive branch. And you sort of saw that after 9/11. Everybody looked to the president, and also, I think he thought the executive branch includes the military. So there was a certain amount of, very much of it, we want to preserve the Constitution. So we needed a facility for the legislative branch, for Congress. Eisenhower also knew that he wasn't just going to build something for Congress. Congress had to authorize it. So this is the days when Lyndon Johnson was Senate Majority Leader and Sam Rayburn was Speaker of the House. Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn ran things. You didn't tell Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn, do it. So apparently he called them together and sort of said, could you, and eventually they took the initiative. In many ways, I think of the bunker as an LBJ project, a Lyndon Johnson project when he was Master of the Senate, which is a great book, incidentally. Robert Cairo's biography of Lyndon. He's working on the 5th volume right now, but the 3rd volume is called Masters of the Senate when Lyndon Johnson was Senate Majority Leader. So I think LBJ is really the kind of key player here.
And I guess then it's worth touching on that. There's a long connection between LBJ and the Greenbrier as well.
Yeah. He'd come here. In fact, if you read this Robert Cairo novel, the series of biographies, the very first anecdote he tells is of Lyndon Johnson here sitting on a blanket in front of Baltimore Row, and a very wealthy, and Lyndon Johnson grew up very, very poor, but he had made it, as a member of the House of Representatives in the late 30s. And this very wealthy Texas businessman is offering him a very good, lucrative business deal in the oil world. And and LBJ turns it down. And there's this guy who was sitting there, a friend of LBJ's, and he can't believe it. I mean, he knows LBJ wants money, you know, and he's turning down a very good deal. And later he says to Lyndon Johnson, "Why did you turn that guy down?" And he said, "Well, I didn't want to be connected to the oil business." And this guy said, "What do you mean? It's Texas. Everybody's connected to the oil business." And he said, "Well, down the road." And the point was that here was LBJ, a nobody, first year in Congress, and he was looking the presidency that far back. And then he made some other visits here too when he was Senate Majority Leader.
And then you touched on it just a moment ago, but I think it's a sort of a common misconception. And when I monitor kind of social media on a daily basis, and still to this day, every day there's people talking about the bunker on social media. But a lot of times people make the comment, "I can't believe they were going to save these congressmen, but they didn't care about the rest of us." But that truthfully wasn't the people that they were wanting to save. It was the government. Yep.
Right, and you know, now with Congress, it's kind of hard to argue that in some ways this was a noble idea to protect, to make sure that the legislative branch continued, and that's why I'm sort of alluding to before this Gaither report. It would have been just astronomically expensive to sort of, you know, what do they say? The members of Congress were going to thrive while we fry, that sort of thing. Well, it's just, I don't know how possible it was to, we didn't have a giant subway like they do in Moscow. Apparently say, you know, the Moscow subway is a giant bomb shelter, you know. But, I mean, noble in the sense that part of what we were doing is protecting the constitutional framework, and I think, and from Eisenhower's point of view, trying to avoid even a military takeover in dire circumstances, you know. And so that's why the bunker was, you know, not just a survival place for these individuals, but it was laid out so they could continue to function as a legislative branch.
So the plan is put in place, construction begins, and this to me is one of the fascinating parts of the bunker story. Is you're trying to keep something quiet, you're trying to keep it a secret, and now you have local construction workers coming in, digging a giant hole. Just how did all that take place?
Well, you know, so incidentally, they kind of haggled for a while. There were a lot of issues to be resolved before they actually started digging the hole, legal issues. And so they came up with this idea of unrecorded dormant lease. Funny, what's an unrecorded dormant? Sounds like some paper in a drawer somewhere, and maybe that's what it was, you know. In fact, we still have the unrecorded dormant lease here. And so anyway, so they finally, everything's all agreed in November of 1958. So once the contract is signed, literally in a couple of days, somebody starts clearing the hill back here. You know, one thing I don't know is who came up with this idea of building two buildings at one time. I don't know whether it had ever been tried before. I've never come across, you know, when they came to the agreement that we were going to build a bunker at the Greenbrier, you can imagine the railroad people who own the Greenbrier said, well, you know, where are they going to put it? And what are we going to tell our share owners? And what are we going to tell Greenbrier guests? You know, I mean, what are you talking about here? You know, and you got 7,000 acres. I guess theoretically, I just don't know who came up with this idea. Let's dig a hole in the ground and build an addition to the Greenbrier right on top of it.
I kind of got ahead of myself. I want to back up for 1 second, but to tie it back to a couple of things that we've already been talking about. The reasons this location was chosen, you touched on some of them already, but we talked about the railroad and how important it was, and I know I've heard you say before that had to be a key factor, was that the government is already making payments on a regular basis to the railroad. So it's sort of easier to hide some of the payments for what's happening here at the bunker.
Oh, right, yeah. But and the other thing is, again, we have to put yourself back in the 50s. There was an assumption that there would be some indication. Back then, you couldn't, just even firing the missiles took a lot more preparation, and you could sort of see things were coming. So today people say, well, there are submarines off the coast and they can come in 20 minutes. Well, maybe that's true now, but it wasn't true in 1958. So this whole idea of getting the members of Congress and getting them on a train and coming down here is not so far-fetched as you might think. And the railroad ownership kind of, the government is still, they do a lot of business. They move military equipment around. Remember, all the negotiations would have gone between the railroad and the government, not so much the Greenbrier. Because I'm going off from one thing or the other. So who came up with this idea? I don't know. We have some. After the bunker closed down, Ted Kleistner, our former president, went over to CSX, was still headquartered in Richmond at that point, and he scooped up a bunch of information. And there are some sort of notes taken. They had meetings up in Washington at the Willard Hotel, and they had meetings on the private railroad cars where they're kind of hashing all this out. How are we gonna do this? So somehow this idea comes along that we'll build it right by. The first thing they had to do was do test borings into the hill up there to make sure that they could actually dig a hole in the ground. Incidentally, other places were considered for the bunker, including the homestead. But apparently, there were geological reasons that the homestead they couldn't dig a hole over there as easy as they could dig a hole over here. They looked at Sweetbriar College. Sweetbriar College was another thing that was over near Lynchburg that was considered as a site.
It's kind of.
Let me make one point before I forget. And you notice these are all private property. Lots of people have said over the years, why didn't they just build this on a military base? It would have been a lot easier, You wouldn't have to come up with this whole story, The military is a function of the executive branch. The military reports to the president. The president's the commander-in-chief. Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn were extremely protective of the independence of the legislative branch. They were not going to build a bunker on property, on real estate controlled by the executive branch. So they were looking at private property.
So as unlikely as it sort of seems that you have this lavish resort, you have Dorothy Draper decor, Sam Snead, as you said, as unlikely as that sort of seems, if you kind of dig deeper, there are a lot of factors that make the Greenbrier make a whole lot of sense.
Right.
There's already the relationship with the Army and the government. There's already the relationship with the railroad and the government, the terrain, the closeness to Washington, D.C., and then obviously Eisenhower's knowledge of the property. There's a lot of factors that really do make it make sense.
And the total improbability. What are you talking about, a bunker at the Greenbrier? That's a ridiculous idea, it made it easy to dismiss it. And that always was the possibility, to just dismiss it. As just a silly, stupid rumor. I can remember there's a guy named Dick Holtzman, a famous guy in the hotel world, was a manager here when it was built, and I met his son once, and they'd all heard rumors, and you had to know Dick Holtzman Sr. This guy was a heavyweight guy, the dad, and the son said he went up to his dad and said, hey, all the kids at school are talking about building this bunker at the Greenbrier. What are they talking about? And his dad looked at him. I knew his dad. He had a steely stare. His dad looked at him and said, who in the hell would ever build a bunker at the Greenbrier? The government is not going to build a facility on private property. And it was like, end of story. Don't ever bring this subject up again.
But that's interesting. That leads into kind of what I was talking about here with the construction is there were a whole lot of rumors out there because there was people working on it. So the cover story was you're building this new conference center. You need expanded conference facilities. So you're building this West Virginia wing on top of it. But when these construction workers get in here, they know that they're building something more.
Well, first of all, it's just something hey, you know, I'm a historian. I don't know these things, but the construction process is a very compartmentalized process. I mean, I talk to people that my job was to lay pipe from here to there. I don't know whether I'm building apartment buildings or office buildings or you know, what the hell, but you know, I just had to. And so, to some degree, it is possible that people really didn't know what the whole thing is. I did talk to one. I remember talking to one guy who worked here. And I asked him that question, you know, and he said, you know, I went up to my supervisor and I said, what are we building here? You know, it's a pretty deep hole in the ground. And the supervisor said, we're paying you a very good salary. We're paying you in cash. One of the things we are paying you to do is not ask questions. And today that sounds sort of ridiculous. But remember, it's not that long after World War II. And that sort of loose lips sink ships mentality during the war, and really, you know, because a lot of these guys were veterans, and I think there was a lot of, you know, we know that you know that we know that you know, and let's not talk about it. I think to some degree the government relied on that.
And that's fascinating to me. Like I think. One thing you can say for sure is this whole project today would never, ever, ever work.
Right.
I mean, because there's no way anybody keeps it a secret for 24 minutes.
Exactly, and you know, it was an isolated location. And to be honest, the government really wasn't worried if some guy in White Sulphur Springs thought this was a bunker. That's not who they were keeping a secret from. And the other issue is, I remember talking to one of the guys who was one of the Forsyth guys who was here, you know, from the get-go, and he said the other thing to remember is we were, like I said a few minutes ago, we were building this to be used right now, and we weren't thinking, oh, let's build a bunker and keep it a secret for 30 years. We thought we got to get this thing done, and they really just kind of really weren't that worried about people in town. I mean. You know, I mean, everybody knew. I often said, on the years I was there, I was never sure. I wasn't really sure if the bunker was there or not, but I was sure it was a secret. So somehow everybody knew. And in talking to people over the years, I've talked to a lot of people who were kids, and they would ask their parents, and their parents would say, I do not want you to ever bring that subject up again. Bill Campbell, the great golfer, used to say it's all because the folks here are Scotch-Irish. And they're warriors, they're patriotic, and they're suspicious of outsiders. And he said that's why they kept it a secret, because people might talk amongst themselves, but you don't talk to outsiders about it.
So in 1962, it opens. And for 30 years, as you said, maintained a constant state of readiness. And what does that mean exactly? What did it take to keep it at a constant state of readiness?
That meant 24/7. If the phone call came, it was ready to go. And so the bunker itself was probably finished by the late 60s. I mean, and then we used 1962. In April of 1962, the first guests actually stayed in the West Virginia wing. And then, you know, they could say, hey, we told you we were adding to the Greenbrier, and we were adding to the Greenbrier, you know? So, son of a gun, here it is. And, you know, the clinic's over there, we mentioned their air-conditioned rooms, which is a big upgrade back at that point. You know, it's funny, as I look at it, it's almost like they built it, and exactly how they were going to maintain it wasn't clear. And this is, I'm not exactly sure who came up with the idea of foresight. That's another one of those things. How did they come up with this idea of, well, we'll have this this company in there, this concessionaire, who do the audio visual, but pretty soon after the bunker was complete, a guy named Fred Hicks came down. He would have been Fritz's predecessor, and John Laundus was, maybe you remember John Nemsick. Some of these guys had been up in Mount Weather before they came here. So they set up this sort of dummy corporation called Forsyth Associates, and there was an office up in Arlington. They maintained it, and apparently nobody was ever there. In fact, I met a guy once. His job was to go by. They had a little storefront somewhere, and he would go and he would listen to the recordings. People would call Forsyth, and of course they never answered anything. And I don't know that anybody actually manned it. This guy just went by periodically and checked the phone messages, and they were listed in the phone book, and as, in fact, they were like Forsyth Associates East, and there was no Forsyth Associates West, so they were really the go-to people, and another reason for putting this here is that you can hide that sort of day-to-day maintenance, a lot of the electricians and plumbers within the Greenbrier's engineering department. So the people who were cleared on the bunker, and there was very, very few, maybe at most, it seemed like the number fluctuated, people of Greenbrier employees who were cleared fluctuated from, 70 or 80, maybe 100, I'm not sure. But they were very protective of, you had to have a need to know before you were allowed in there. So you had the Foresight people were really the communications people. So there were pretty high-level communication systems there. And they tended to be all retired military. And Forsyth, I guess, at maximum was 12 people, I think. Now, when all this came out, I thought Forsyth was 4 people. Yeah, who these other 8 people were, I don't know who they were. But they had a building across the street over near the stables. And
so the Greenbrier employees that were cleared, I think it kind of goes back to what you were talking about with the construction, is you're focused on a specific area of your job. That's sort of the way the Greenbrier employees were too. They didn't have free reign access to the bunker.
Right.
They had a certain job, a certain position of the bunker that they worked on, and that was it.
And members of our security department were cleared. And they would actually escort you in. And they would take you to your work site. You would do your work site, and you didn't talk to anybody. And you talked about how quiet it was in there, kind of eerie how quiet it was inside. Maybe some machines kind of humming, and that was about the only sign inside. So yeah. So and they all signed non-disclosure agreements.
Question I've never asked before. The Greenbrier employees, I know that the Forsyths had the office and the secret door out of the office into the bunker.
Yeah.
How did the Greenbrier employees access the bunker? Where did they go in?
Well, either that same way, or maybe they came up the big tunnel, I suppose would be it. Is Deanna still here?
Yeah. The main hall door, that main hall door that had danger high voltage on it, just like it has the CSX information.
Right.
They could go through there. There was just one single door that was
Okay.
always locked. And it had a sign on it that said employees only. And then you went on to the next section where you would have encountered the double doors that were locked. And it did look different back then, but much plainer than what we have today, of course. And it was just a single opening that I don't guess employees ever asked where it went to unless they had to utilize it. And then,
That's
of
right.
course, one of Forsyth was with them to take them back, escort them.
I know that just kind of reminds me, I know Bob has a lot of personal stories that we're going to get into in just a minute of your interaction with the bunker. But my lone personal story of the bunker as a kid is I remember going to, I believe it was some sort of Cub Scout or Boy Scout event it was in the exhibit hall. And a couple of my friends and I were in there, and we were just kind of running around, and I kept asking, why are there so many columns in this room? I could not figure that out. That vision of all these columns just always sort of stood out in my mind. Like, what a strange room. Why are all these columns here? And I was in elementary school, so I didn't think too much of it. But looking back on it now, that's the vivid memory I have is running around that room just thinking, there's got to be a reason all these columns.
And engineers tend to ask that question too. You know, a lot of things are sort of clear in hindsight, but at the time, you know, it's just sort of a mystery. Why are things this way?
And the picture of the doors here is kind of a similar thing. If you look at that door, and when you go on the bunker tour, you see the giant crack above the door, and you say, well, why did nobody notice that? And why does nobody notice these strange screens sitting here? So, as you said, in hindsight, it really seems sort of obvious, but if you don't know what you're looking for, it doesn't jump out to you at all.
There are a lot of doors. I worked there for 40, and there are a lot of doors. They were housekeeping closets. You know, they had supplies in there. I mean, they're all over the place, you know, and I didn't go around opening every door. I certainly didn't say, oh, there's a crack. I bet there's a, 10-ton glass door on the other side of that. I figured, well, who knows, they store chairs in there or something like that, or transmission, electrical transmitters, that sort of thing.
It's funny to me, too, working here, you know that people at nighttime, maybe they have a couple too many drinks somewhere or whatever, and a lot of strange things happening. You would think somebody moved those screens at some point and said, why are these hinges here?
Yeah, right.
But it's just, I guess, if you don't know what you're looking for,
right. And the whole idea was just to be as low key as possible, just don't ruffle things.